In 1942, Army planners drew housing for 13,000 people in a narrow Tennessee valley. Less than 3 years later, 75,000 lived behind guarded gates, making Oak Ridge the fifth largest urban area in the state. Yet the place appeared on no public map, and most residents could not say what their factories produced. Uranium moved through millions of square feet of factory space. Oak Ridge was built for one purpose. Almost everyone who lived there was forbidden to know it. Long before Oak Ridge appeared on an Army plan, the land had already drawn its own lines. Black Oak Ridge, Pine Ridge, Chestnut Ridge, and Haw Ridge ran across eastern Tennessee in long, nearly parallel folds, with narrow valleys pressed between them. At the Clinch River, the ground stood about 775 feet above sea level. Along the highest ridgeline, it reached roughly 1,205 feet. That difference was enough to divide one valley from the next, hiding fields, houses, and eventually entire factories from anyone standing only a short distance away. The Clinch River curved around three sides of this country. Smaller streams came down from the ridges, crossed the bottomland, and joined Poplar Creek, or the river itself. The slopes were too steep for large farms, but strips of soil near the water could hold corn, oats, wheat, tobacco, and vegetables. Forest covered much of what could not be plowed. For generations, the shape of the land determined where a family could plant, where a road could pass, and where a ferry had to be kept. Archaeological evidence within the present Oak Ridge Reservation reaches back at least 14,000 years. Different American Indian peoples occupied and used the river valleys over that long span, and the region eventually formed part of the Cherokee world. The written record of white settlement often begins with a 1798 treaty that opened the land between Walden's Ridge and the Clinch River to newcomers. The land itself did not begin there. By then, trails, river crossings, hunting grounds, and places of settlement had existed for thousands of years. Families carrying land grants came through the Cumberland Gap from Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky. Many were Scots-Irish. They built single-pen and double-pen log cabins, cleared manageable pieces of bottomland, and raised enough livestock to carry them through the year. When sawmills became more common, frame houses replaced many of the cabins. The farms remained small. Corn was the dependable crop. Oats, wheat, garden vegetables, and fruit filled out what a household needed, while timber, cattle, grain, or tobacco produced the little surplus that could be traded or sold. Money did not organize these valleys as completely as it did the towns beyond them. A farmer might exchange grain, livestock, labor, or timber rather than pay cash. A blacksmith could shoe horses during the week and operate a grist mill on weekends. Churches doubled as meeting halls. Schools occupied one or two rooms. General stores held mail, tools, cloth, lamp oil, and news from outside. The communities were not dense enough to look like towns from a ridge. Their centers were a church, a store, a spring, or a bend in the road. The main road through the valley was the old Emory Coach Road. It crossed the Clinch River by ferry at Bull Run, passed through Emory Valley, joined the route later known as Robertsville Road, and continued through Sugar Grove Valley toward the Knoxville-Nashville Turnpike. At Cross Springs in Robertsville, travelers stopped to water their horses. Farmers operated other ferries wherever the river interrupted a useful path. Along the eastern bank, a railroad followed the Clinch as it bent north toward Clinton. Robertsville had grown around land acquired by Collins Roberts beginning in 1804. By the 19th century, it contained several stores, a school, churches, farmhouses, and the blacksmith shop that became a grist mill on weekends. Scarborough lay along Bethel Valley Road, with 3 country stores, an elementary school, and 4 churches. At the one-room school near New Bethel Baptist Church, children carried water from a spring and drank from the same dipper. In these valleys, a spring could be infrastructure. Farther west, wheat had begun forming before Tennessee entered the Union. 2 early grist mills worked along Poplar Creek. By 1942, the community held a post office, a Masonic lodge, stores, schools, 4 churches, and Wheat High School, which had earlier been known as Roan College and Poplar Creek Seminary. Farmers grew corn and tobacco, and the community became known for its peach orchards. The George Jones Memorial Baptist Church, built in 1901, stood on land donated by the minister whose name it carried. The first large federal change arrived not with the Army, but with concrete poured across the Clinch River. Construction of Norris Dam began in 1933 and finished in 1936. Its wall rose 265 feet and stretched 1,860 feet from bank to bank. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought flood control and hydroelectric power to a region where farms had previously depended on the river without controlling it. Roads improved. Electric lines advanced. Water that had moved according to rain and season could now be stored, released, and measured. Elza was younger than the other communities. It had grown from a flag stop on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad rather than from a church or mill. Paul Elza owned a shed near the tracks while railroad crews built a bridge and underpass. Lumber and construction material marked with his name were left there, and the label remained. There was a country store, but no post office. Residents collected their mail at Dossett. By 1942, about 1,000 families lived among these valleys and communities. Their houses were scattered, but the ground was not empty. It contained ferries, orchards, graves, springs, churchyards, wagon roads, railroad tracks, and names carried across generations. One of those names was still painted on freight and left beside a small trackside shed. Elza. In September 1942, Major General Leslie Groves stood near the little railroad stop at Elza and looked southwest across the ridges. The day was humid. Beyond him lay timber, cornfields, churches, graveyards, and farm roads curling through narrow valleys toward the Clinch River. To the Army, those ridges offered concealment, the river offered water, and the nearby Tennessee Valley Authority offered electricity in quantities few places in America could supply. What had sheltered small communities for generations now made them useful to a war project whose purpose almost no one there would be permitted to know. Groves approved the location on September 19. 10 days later, Under Secretary of War Robert Patterson authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to acquire approximately 56,000 acres. The people living on that land were not asked whether they wished to sell. The federal government could take private property for public use through condemnation, with compensation to follow. Ordinarily, land passed from one owner to another through offers, counteroffers, titles, surveys, and time. Here, time was precisely what the Army believed it did not have. The acquisition moved under wartime secrecy, and the families receiving notices were told only that their property was required for the war effort. Surveyors and appraisers began moving through the valleys in October. Between then and March 1943, the Corps acquired 866 separate tracts, totaling roughly 56,000 acres. Later additions would bring the reservation close to 59,000 acres, an expanse larger than Manhattan Island 3 times over, spread across parts of Anderson and Roane counties. On an Army map, the work appeared as lines, tract numbers, and acreage. On the ground, each tract contained smaller things: a smokehouse blackened above the door, a springhouse built low against the summer heat, fruit trees planted by someone's grandfather, fence wire stretched around a pasture, boards in a barn worn smooth by harness and hands. Nearly 3,000 people lived inside the proposed boundary. About 1,000 families had to go. Some were given only 2 weeks. 2 weeks was enough time to sign papers, load a wagon or truck, move livestock, and leave, provided there was somewhere to go and money with which to get there. For many families, neither was certain. No federal funds had been set aside for relocation expenses. Some residents left before they received payment for their property. In certain cases, the check did not arrive for 6 months. Crops remained in the ground. Furniture and family possessions had to be abandoned when they could not be moved quickly enough. Replacement land was difficult to find. The Tennessee Valley Authority had already purchased farms for the Norris and Watts Bar projects, and reservoir water had covered additional bottomland. Some Oak Ridge families had been displaced once before by a dam or a national park. Now the government had returned under a different agency with a different map. The final cost of acquiring the land came to about $2.6 million. In Roane County, the average payment was reported at $34.26 per acre. In Anderson County, it was $44.10. The Army relied on broad assessments and individual inspections, while residents argued that appraisers were placing Depression-era values on farms being taken in a wartime emergency. At public meetings, landowners complained that the prices could not purchase comparable property elsewhere. The government answered with records showing that local land sales between 1937 and 1942 had averaged about $23 per acre. Both figures could be accurate. One measured what land had sold for during years of scarce money. The other measured what a family now needed to begin again. That difference is worth pausing over. A small number of owners challenged the valuations in court. Those who succeeded received, on average, about 15% more than the original offers. It was an increase, though far below the 40 or 50% by which some families believed their property had been undervalued. Most did not sue. Lawyers cost money, wartime condemnation was difficult to resist, and the result of the case could change the payment but not the boundary. The responses were not uniform. Some residents were furious. Others accepted the loss as part of a war that had already taken sons and brothers overseas. Don Watson remembered his mother saying, "If it'll get the boys home, they can take the home. I will not complain." Her words did not make the move easier. They simply placed the house and the war in the same sentence. At New Bethel Baptist Church, the congregation was told that its building would be demolished. The members emptied the church treasury to erect a stone monument beside the cemetery, preserving the names of the people buried there before access to the ground passed beyond their control. The Army did not tear the church down. It kept the building and later used it as a meeting place. The congregation left. The walls remained. Across the reservation, the military retained about 180 houses to ease an immediate shortage of quarters. One belonged to Luther Brannan, who had finished building it only months before the acquisition. The house became a residence and headquarters for Groves, the man who had approved the site. Most of the other pre-war homes would eventually disappear. By March 1943, wire fencing enclosed the valleys. Roads that had connected farms now ended at guarded entrances. The names Wheat, Robertsville, Scarborough, and Elza survived, but increasingly as names on military maps, gates, and construction routes. Inside the fence, houses, roads, utilities, stores, schools, and buses would soon belong to the United States government. The porch remained for a while. So did the well, the barn, and the winter fields. On the deed, the owner had changed. Early in January 1943, architects at Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill received a topographic map of an unidentified piece of land. The place names had been removed. Their instructions were to design 3,000 houses, together with schools, churches, stores, and public services, for a town of approximately 13,000 people. They would have little grading equipment for the steep ground. They had 3 days. John Merrill later recalled that the Army Corps of Engineers approved the initial plan in 2 hours. When the architects asked where they were expected to build it, the Army would not say. They learned their destination only after boarding a train from New York toward Knoxville. On paper, 13,000 was a manageable population, roughly 4 people for each planned house. On the ground, the site stretched across ridges that rose abruptly from narrow valleys, with creeks, farm roads, woods, and recently vacated fields occupying the space between them. Stone and Webster had first proposed laying out the town as a grid. The Army rejected it. Straight streets belonged to level ground. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill allowed the hills to make part of the plan. Outer Drive followed the upper slope. Tennessee Avenue ran below it. The avenues connecting them curved with the land and received state names arranged roughly from east to west: California, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania. Smaller streets took the first letter of the avenue from which they branched. Cedar Lane came off California Avenue. Malvern Road came off Michigan. The pattern helped residents find their way before street signs appeared. The original town contained 3 neighborhoods: Pine Valley, Elm Grove, and Outer Drive. Each was to have an elementary school and a small commercial center containing what the planners considered the necessities of daily life: a market, drugstore, barber, beauty shop, shoe repair shop, fire hall, and bus stop. Larger stores, theaters, a high school, a guest house, and government offices gathered around Jackson Square. The Army did not want the place to look like an Army post. Existing trees were left standing where construction allowed. Houses were turned toward the inside of their blocks to give their occupants some privacy. Sidewalks appeared along only one side of the main roads. 2 neighboring houses shared a service yard, so coal, garbage, and utility work could be handled with fewer men. It was careful planning under conditions that did not remain still. The most recognizable houses were made from cemesto, a prefabricated material developed during the Depression. Each panel had a fiberboard core with a cement asbestos compound bonded to both faces. The panels resisted water and fire, required less scarce lumber, and could be fastened to wooden framing by crews performing the same motions repeatedly. The houses were identified not by architectural names but by letters. There were A houses, B houses, C houses, D houses, and E houses, followed later by F, G, and H designs. The letter indicated the floor plan, size, and number of rooms. It also helped determine who might receive the keys. A single cemesto house could be erected in about 2 hours. With multiple crews working at once, a completed house came off the human assembly line approximately every 30 minutes. On the busiest days, between 30 and 40 families moved into newly finished units. That number is worth holding beside the mud outside. Only the principal streets were paved during the early months. In dry weather, traffic lifted dust from the roads until it entered clothing, windows, and throats. In wet weather, the dirt became dense clay-like mud, capable of stopping a private automobile. Buses continued through it because they had to. Workers stepped down beside new houses carrying suitcases, groceries, and government housing assignments, then crossed ground that had not yet become a yard. The first construction phase produced approximately 3,000 single-family houses, 14 dormitories, and 3 apartment buildings. Those alone should have approached the original target. But the Army also ordered nearly 1,000 hutments, small temporary shelters with thin walls, and more than 1,000 trailers. The first trailer received its occupant on July 13, 1943. The first cemesto house became available 2 weeks later. By then, the plan was already too small. During the summer of 1943, the projected population rose from 13,000 to 42,000. The architects extended the town westward. New frame houses appeared in East Village and West Village. Dormitories lengthened into H-shaped and S-shaped buildings, with 2 to 4 people assigned to each room. Trailer camps spread along roads that had been intended to serve neighborhoods of detached houses. Near the gaseous diffusion plant, 1 additional camp was built for 2,000 workers. The revised plan lasted no better than the first. In 1944, the estimate rose again, this time to 66,000. Every increase required more than beds. It required water pipes, sewers, coal deliveries, cafeterias, classrooms, buses, fire protection, laundry rooms, and stores with enough shelves to serve people arriving faster than goods could be stocked. A town planned around 3 neighborhoods expanded to 8, then filled the spaces between them with barracks, hutments, trailers, and buildings borrowed from other federal housing projects. Housing assignments imposed another order on the landscape. Semesto houses, the largest and most comfortable units, generally went to senior military officers, scientists, engineers, and ranking civilian personnel. Heads of families received houses when space permitted. Single workers usually entered dormitories. Clerical workers, drivers, and lower-paid laborers were more likely to be placed in trailers, barracks, old farmhouses, or hutments. Housing was also segregated by race, a division that would take physical form in a separate section of the reservation. By 1945, Oak Ridge contained 9,143 family units, 93 dormitories, more than 1,500 hutments, hundreds of trailers, and 181 farmhouses left from the valleys before the fence. Nearly 14,000 people slept in dormitories. More than 31,000 lived in barracks, trailers, or hutments. The population reached approximately 75,000, making the 2-year-old settlement the 5th largest city in Tennessee. 13,000 remained in the original plan. Around it stood a city almost 6 times larger, its lettered houses facing inward beneath preserved trees, while beyond their service yards the dormitories, trailers, plywood walls, coal piles, buses, dust, and mud continued to spread. If you had driven toward Oak Ridge during the war, the road would eventually have narrowed toward a wooden guardhouse. A military policeman would stop the vehicle, examine the passes of everyone inside, and search the car before allowing it through. Beyond the barrier were houses, schools, buses, theaters, cafeterias, and enough people to form one of Tennessee's largest cities. None of that was invisible. The secret was what connected it all. A barbed wire fence enclosed roughly 92 square miles, a long piece of Tennessee running 17 miles through ridges and valleys. Wartime accounts generally describe 7 named gates around its perimeter, though one official historical document also gives account of 8, apparently including an additional guarded entrance. The 7 remembered gates were Elza, Edgemoor, Solway, White Wing, Gallagher, Blair, and Oliver Springs. Each faced a road leading toward a different part of East Tennessee. Elza received traffic from Clinton. Solway faced Knoxville. Gallagher stood near the Clinch River on the road toward Kingston. Together, they transformed ordinary roads into controlled openings through the fence. Passing the outer gate did not mean a person could travel anywhere inside. Additional checking stations separated the town from the industrial sites. Ridges divided the reservation into narrow compartments, placing the Y-12 plant, the X-10 reactor, and the K-25 plant behind folds of earth as well as guards. A worker cleared to enter Oak Ridge might not be cleared to enter a plant. A worker admitted to one building might not be permitted inside the building beside it. The geography had become part of the security system. Every resident older than 9 was required to wear an identification badge. Adults carried them to work, cafeterias, stores, and buses. Children carried them through a town in which the government owned their school, their house, and the road between them. The badge identified the individual, but it also marked status and access. It showed a guard where the wearer belonged. Roadblocks appeared inside the reservation to check whether people were where they were supposed to be. Vehicles were searched both entering and leaving. Military police staffed the perimeter gates and checking stations. Private corporations operating the plants maintained their own guards, while the Roan Anderson Company protected administrative buildings and town facilities. By 1945, Oak Ridge employed approximately 4,900 civilian guards, 740 military policemen, and more than 400 civilian police officers. The civilian police force alone amounted to about 14 officers for every 1,000 residents. Comparable southern towns had fewer than 2. That number is worth pausing over. Oak Ridge had more people guarding, checking, patrolling, and policing it than many American towns had people. The fence controlled bodies. The badges controlled movement. The deeper system controlled knowledge. Signs appeared along roads, inside buildings, and near factory entrances. The best known carried a sentence broken into short commands. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. Residents were expected not to discuss their jobs, even with husbands, wives, roommates, or friends who worked elsewhere on the reservation. A casual description of a machine, a production delay, a shipment, or an unusual material might provide a piece that someone else could connect to another. Employees who talked too freely could be questioned, removed from their work, and dismissed. Mail was examined. Periodicals and library materials were monitored. Dictionaries reportedly had to be replaced because readers searched the page containing the word uranium so often that it became worn and difficult to read. In a city where technical words could cost a person a job, the damaged page recorded a curiosity that could not safely become conversation. The governing principle was compartmentalization. Each employee received enough information to perform an assigned task, but usually not enough to understand the system surrounding it. An operator might watch a meter and adjust controls. A maintenance worker might replace a valve. A clerk might record columns of numbers. A truck driver might deliver sealed material between guarded buildings. The work could be precise, repetitive, and urgent without revealing its final purpose. Even the plant names offered little help. Y12, X10, and K25 sounded like warehouse locations or entries in an Army filing cabinet. One plant used magnets to separate forms of uranium. Another tested a graphite reactor and produced small quantities of plutonium. A third forced uranium gas through barriers containing openings too small to see. Most employees encountered only the machinery, chemicals, gauges, or paperwork immediately before them. They were told that the work might shorten the war. The policy extended far above the factory floor. Harry Truman served as vice president, while the Manhattan Project consumed labor, steel, copper, electricity, and billions of federal dollars. He was not fully informed about it until nearly 2 weeks after Franklin Roosevelt died and Truman became president. A 10-year-old in Oak Ridge needed a badge to reach home. The Vice President of the United States did not know why the city existed, yet secrecy did not mean silence. Oak Ridge produced the noise of any crowded industrial place. Bus brakes, cafeteria trays, shift whistles, construction hammers, children outside dormitories, and tires moving through mud. Trains entered. Power lines crossed the valleys. At night, thousands of windows burned behind the fence. People outside could see that something enormous was happening. Workers inside could see more of it than anyone else. What neither group possessed was the complete arrangement. A pipe connected to another pipe. A bus route ended at a guarded building. Numbers moved from a meter to a clipboard, then from a clipboard to an office. Materials arrived under one name and departed under another. Each piece had an address, a worker, and a badge. No ordinary resident held the map that joined them. Inside the gate, a badge determined where a person could go. A housing assignment determined where that person would sleep. Oak Ridge did not have a private housing market. A new employee could not choose a neighborhood, compare rents, or purchase a house near work. The government owned the land and the buildings, while the Roane Anderson Company assigned the rooms. Job classification, salary, family size, marital status, and race entered the decision before a key was issued. For higher-ranking white civilian and military employees, scientists, and engineers, the address often began with a letter. The Semesto houses came in 8 principal designs, A through H. Earlier letters generally meant less floor space and fewer rooms. An A house was a modest two-bedroom dwelling. Farther along the alphabet, a family might receive additional bedrooms, a larger living area, or, in the D house, a separate dining room. The assignment reflected both the number of people in the family and the employee's place inside the project. However small, these were recognizable suburban houses. They stood on concrete block foundations and had open porches, wooden doors, casement windows, and hardwood floors. Linoleum covered the kitchen and bathroom. A coal-fired furnace moved warm air through the rooms. Some designs had a broad picture window facing a preserved stand of trees or the interior of the block. There were no basements, and the walls were prefabricated panels rather than brick or solid lumber. Still, a family could close the front door, eat at its own table, use its own bathroom, and place children in separate beds. Single workers usually entered a different system. More than 90 dormitories stood in groups across Oak Ridge, many built in the shape of an H or an S. Some housed men, others women, and a smaller number married couples. A room intended for 2 people might soon contain 3 or 4. Their beds and belongings fitted around occupants working different shifts. One person returned while another was dressing for work. Alarm clocks rang at several hours of the night. Doors opened and closed. Shoes crossed wooden floors. With the plants operating around the clock, a dormitory never fully slept. By 1945, nearly 14,000 people lived this way. Employees earning less than $60 a week, including guards, firefighters, clerks, plant laborers, and construction workers, were more likely to receive trailers or hutments. Nearly 4,000 trailers eventually collected in dense camps along the turnpike, around Gamble Valley, near Illinois Avenue, and beside K-25. They formed neighborhoods with cafeterias, stores, schools, recreation halls, and theaters, but the trailers themselves had no bathrooms. Residents carried water from shared bathhouses and filled a tank inside the trailer each day. The same bathhouse provided showers and toilets for rows of neighboring units. A trailer had thin walls and little space, but it could hold a small household together. Race created a boundary that family size did not cross. Approximately 7,000 black Americans came to Oak Ridge for Manhattan project work. Many recruited from Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Some had left farm labor or domestic service for a government paycheck. Caddy Strickland had earned $13 a month, working in a library at Auburn, Alabama. At Oak Ridge, she made $27 a week as a janitor at K-27. More than 8 times her earlier monthly wage when measured across 4 weeks. The higher pay did not open the alphabet houses. Black workers were largely restricted to construction, cooking, cleaning, coal delivery, domestic service, and other forms of manual labor. Most lived outside the reservation and traveled through the gates. Those housed inside were assigned mainly to 2 segregated hutment areas, one near the K-25 construction camp and another near the intersection of Illinois Avenue and Scarborough Road. Some single white men also lived in hutments. No white women did. Each hutment measured 16 feet by 16 feet, a square of plywood sitting close to the ground. Inside was one unpartitioned room, 4 beds, and a central oil stove. There was no bathroom and no running water. 4 windows offered ventilation, but they had no glass or screens, only wooden shutters. Open them in summer and dust and insects entered. Close them in winter, and the room lost its light. The structures were designed for 4 residents. As the population grew, 5 men were sometimes placed in one hutment, or 6 women. Beds, lockers, chairs, clothing, and work shoes occupied a room smaller than many suburban living rooms. 12 hutments shared a single bathhouse. That meant between 48 and 72 people, using 4 shower heads, 4 wash basins, and 4 toilets. Water existed in the housing area, but it stood beyond the hutment door, across bare ground that became dust when dry and mud when wet. By the summer of 1945, approximately 2,000 black workers lived in these compounds. The housing remained divided by sex. Black married couples who entered Oak Ridge together were assigned to separate areas, regardless of whether both worked for the project. One former resident remembered being warned before arriving that there would be no housing for him and his wife together. A rough fence made from scrap boards separated the men's and women's hutments. A guarded gate controlled the opening. The women's compound had a 10 o'clock curfew, and men were officially forbidden to enter. Residents called it the pen. Along parts of the fence, worn paths and chairs placed against the boards showed where people continued to meet. The same government operated both sides of Oak Ridge. It delivered coal to the Semestito houses and water to the buildings without pipes. It maintained the furnace beneath the Alphabet House and the oil stove at the center of the hutment. One employee returned from a classified office to hardwood floors, a picture window, and a private bath. Another returned from cleaning that office to plywood walls and a shutter where glass might have been. The alphabet ended at H. Beyond it stood rows of unlettered squares, 4 beds to a room, with water carried back from the bathhouse. Natural uranium did not arrive at Oak Ridge ready for a bomb. In every 1,000 atoms, roughly 993 were uranium-238. Only about 7 were uranium-235, the isotope capable of sustaining the rapid chain reaction required for the weapon being designed at Los Alamos. The two behaved almost identically in a chemical flask. They formed the same compounds, reacted with the same elements, and passed through ordinary industrial processes together. The useful atoms were only slightly lighter. Oak Ridge existed to separate them. No one had ever attempted that separation on anything approaching the necessary scale. Laboratory apparatus could produce traces. A bomb required pounds. General Leslie Groves and the scientists advising him faced a choice among methods that were unfinished, temperamental, and enormously expensive, and they answered by refusing to choose. They would build more than one. If a barrier failed, magnets might succeed. If magnets proved too slow, heat might supply part of the answer. Concrete would be poured while the machinery was still being designed. At Y-12, construction began in February 1943 around the electromagnetic method developed by Ernest Lawrence and his colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley. Uranium was vaporized, given an electrical charge, and accelerated through a vacuum chamber. Powerful magnets bent the moving ions into arcs. Because uranium-235 was lighter, its path curved slightly more tightly than that of uranium-238, allowing the two streams to strike different collectors. The difference was almost insultingly small. The machinery was not. The separators, called calutrons, were arranged in great oval formations, known as racetracks. Their magnetic coils required so much copper that the Army, competing with every shipyard, aircraft plant, and ammunition factory in the country, turned to the United States Treasury. Roughly 14,000 tons of government silver were borrowed, shaped into electrical conductors, and installed behind the fences at Oak Ridge. Metal normally associated with coins and vaults now carried current through machines for sorting invisible atoms. At its peak, Y-12 employed about 22,000 people. Its calutrons could produce highly enriched uranium, but they demanded constant attention and enormous amounts of power. The process worked. It was also slow, costly, and hungry for labor. Beyond Y-12 rose K-25, intended to perform the same separation without sending individual ions around magnetic curves. Here, uranium was combined with fluorine to form uranium hexafluoride, a substance that could be handled as a gas. That gas was forced against a porous barrier. Molecules containing the lighter uranium-235 passed through marginally more readily than molecules containing uranium-238. One passage accomplished almost nothing. Thousands of passages could. The gas moved through more than 3,000 stages, each one adding a fraction to the concentration achieved by the stage before it. The barrier required pores too small to see. distributed evenly across material, strong enough to withstand industrial pressure. Pumps, seals, pipes, and welds had to contain a gas that found minute defects. Across miles of piping, a pinhole could become a production problem. Construction began in 1943 before engineers had finished solving many of those problems. The result was a U-shaped building approximately half a mile long, 1,000 feet wide, and spread across 44 acres. K-25 was larger in footprint than the Pentagon and cost about $500 million wartime dollars. Steel columns, process pipes, compressor rooms, and barrier cells filled a structure built for a method that had not yet proved it could operate continuously. By early 1945, sections of it were doing exactly that. The third uranium plant came later. In 1944, with the deadline tightening, the Army added S-50, a liquid thermal diffusion facility built beside the power infrastructure near the Clinch River. Workers completed it in just 69 days. Inside stood 2,142 columns, each rising 48 feet. Within those columns, a thin film of uranium hexafluoride was held between hot and cool surfaces. The temperature difference produced a slight separation between the lighter and heavier isotopes. S-50 raised the uranium-235 concentration from its natural level of about 0.7% to approximately 0.9%, 0.2 of a percentage point. It had taken more than 2,000 columns, each as tall as a 4-story building, to make that small change. But the plants no longer had to defeat one another. As the equipment came online, Oak Ridge joined the methods into a production chain. S-50 performed the first rough enrichment. K-25 took that material and pushed the concentration higher through its cascades of porous barriers. Y-12 received feed that was already enriched and used its calutrons to carry the uranium toward weapons-grade concentration, near 90% uranium-235. 3 incomplete answers became one industrial sentence, written in heat, gas, and magnetic force. X-10 followed a different branch. It was not another method for separating uranium-235. Its graphite reactor used uranium-238, the isotope Oak Ridge possessed in abundance, and exposed it to neutrons. Some uranium atoms absorbed those neutrons and changed through radioactive decay into plutonium-239, an element scarcely present in nature. In early November 1943, the X-10 graphite reactor began operating. Workers loaded uranium fuel into horizontal channels running through a massive block of graphite. Air moved through the structure for cooling. Behind thick shielding, the reactor produced the first gram quantities of plutonium made in a continuously operating reactor, while an adjoining chemical facility demonstrated that the new element could be separated from irradiated uranium. X-10 was a pilot plant. Its larger descendants would rise at Hanford, Washington, where the Columbia River could cool full-scale reactors and remote desert land could contain the production complex. Samples from Oak Ridge went to Los Alamos. Procedures developed there traveled west. The small graphite reactor in Tennessee became the working model for factories built to manufacture an element that had not existed when most of Oak Ridge's residents were born. By one official accounting, Oak Ridge absorbed roughly $1.1 billion of a Manhattan project, commonly priced at about $2 billion. The money became treasury silver inside magnet coils, steel around diffusion cells, tall thermal columns, graphite blocks, electrical lines, chemical equipment, and pay envelopes for tens of thousands of workers who knew only their assigned portion. At one end of the reservation, uranium passed through heat, then miles of barriers, then a magnetic arc, losing more of its heavier atoms at every stage. At another, a uranium slug disappeared into graphite and emerged carrying traces of an element it had not contained before. Outside, guards checked identification cards at the gates. Inside, Oak Ridge was learning how to manufacture what nature had provided only in fragments. In 1943, Secretary of War Henry Stimson asked the United States Treasury for 6,000 tons of silver. The request was unusual enough. It did not remain that size. By the time the Manhattan Project had secured what Y-12 required, approximately 13,540 short tons had left the federal vaults at West Point, New York. 395 million troy ounces, worth more than 300 million wartime dollars. Treasury metal that had been stored as bars was fabricated into electrical conductors and wound through the machinery of a plant whose purpose the Treasury itself was not permitted to discuss openly. Copper belonged in those windings. Copper was also needed for communications wire, electric motors, ships, aircraft, and millions of brass shell casings. Silver carried current almost as well, and the government possessed it in quantities few private companies could have imagined requesting. One federal department lent its treasure to another department's machine. Once installed, the silver disappeared inside Y-12's racetracks. Electric current passed through the windings and energized the great magnets surrounding the calutron vacuum chambers. Inside those chambers, streams of charged uranium ions curved toward separate collectors. Outside them sat rows of young women facing control panels. The machines were counted more carefully than the women. Y-12 contained 1,152 calutrons. Official accounts variously described the female cubicle operators as several thousand, or approximately 10,000 over the life of the wartime project. Many had recently finished high school. Tennessee Eastman Company recruited heavily from Knoxville and the farming and mill communities of eastern Tennessee, where a job at Oak Ridge offered better wages than many textile plants and stores could provide. They arrived by bus, passed the guards, showed their badges, and entered buildings filled with pipes, cables, steel frames, vacuum equipment, and magnetic fields powerful enough to bend a moving atom. Then they sat on wooden stools. A station consisted of a large upright panel fitted with meters, switches, handles, and adjustment knobs. During an 8-hour shift, an operator watched a needle and kept it within a narrow range. If it drifted, she turned a control by a prescribed amount. If the reading moved beyond what she had been trained to correct, she summoned a supervisor. She recorded figures, watched the next meter, and began again. The work required patience more than physical strength, but it was not passive. A careless adjustment could scatter the ion beam, interrupt collection, or reduce the small amount of useful material reaching the receiver. The operator had to recognize change without knowing what the change meant. She learned the panel as a driver learns the sound of an engine, except that no one told her where the vehicle was going. Most were told only that their work would help the war effort. Some understood that they were separating a material. A few with scientific training made informed guesses. Most did not know they were handling uranium, did not know what uranium-235 was, and did not know that the material accumulating beyond their panels was being sent toward a weapon laboratory in New Mexico. Questions crossed organizational boundaries. Instructions did not. That division of knowledge had been built into Oak Ridge from the gates inward. A maintenance worker could know the vacuum pumps. An electrician could know the current passing through the silver. A chemist could know the material entering or leaving a process. A cubicle operator knew where the needle belonged. Each person possessed enough information to keep one portion of the plant moving and not enough to assemble the city's purpose. Even the scientists who had helped develop the calutron did not necessarily operate it better. At Berkeley, physicists and graduate students had adjusted the experimental machines themselves. When production managers compared their results with those of the Oak Ridge operators, the young women produced more consistently. A formal production contest reportedly confirmed it. The scientists paused to investigate fluctuations and experimented with the settings. The operators followed the procedure, held the controls steady, and called a supervisor when something changed. The scientists understood why the needle moved. The operators kept it where it belonged. Behind the panels, the electromagnetic process took place in stages. Alpha calutrons made the first separation, producing uranium that contained a larger share of uranium-235 than the material that had entered. Beta calutrons received that partially enriched feed and refined it further. Each pass discarded far more uranium than it collected. Each receiver held an amount almost absurdly small beside the building, the workforce, the power lines, and the treasury silver surrounding it. Nothing at the control stool resembled a bomb. There was no metal sphere or assembled weapon, only needles shifting across numbered faces and hands returning them toward center. The uranium accumulated elsewhere, collected from the machines, chemically recovered, measured, and sent through the process again. A woman could complete an entire shift without seeing the substance her movements had helped separate. Through 1944 and 1945, the 152 calutrons at Y12 produced roughly 140 pounds of uranium-235, about the weight of one of the young operators seated before a control panel. To obtain it, the plant employed thousands of people, drew current through hundreds of millions of troy ounces of silver, and repeated the same slight division of heavy atoms and light atoms day and night. At each shift change, one row of women rose from the wooden stools, and another took its place. Buses waited beyond the building. Badges passed back through guarded doors. Inside Beta 3, the needles continued to tremble within their narrow bands. Silver carried current where copper should have been, and material the operators knew only as the product gathered in the receivers a little at a time. By April 1945, Oak Ridge had produced approximately 25 kilograms of bomb-grade uranium. During the next 3 months, the amount doubled. S-50 pushed natural uranium through its first slight enrichment. K-25 drove the material through thousands of diffusion stages. Y-12 sent it around magnetic curves, collected it, processed it, and sent it through again. By the middle of July, about 50 kilograms of highly enriched uranium had reached Los Alamos, most of it containing roughly 89% uranium-235. 50 kilograms was about 110 pounds, the weight of a heavy suitcase. To produce it, the government had taken nearly 59,000 acres, constructed 3 separation plants, borrowed millions of troy ounces of treasury silver, employed tens of thousands of people, and built a city larger than most cities in Tennessee. By July, Y-12 alone had consumed about 1.6 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity, measured as energy. The factory had used roughly 100 times what the weapon would release. The uranium traveled west in small shipments while Oak Ridge continued working. At Los Alamos, machinists and weapons specialists shaped it for Little Boy, a gun-type weapon designed to force 2 separate uranium masses together inside a steel casing. Unlike the plutonium device detonated at Trinity on July 16, the complete uranium bomb was not tested before combat use. Its design had been tested without fissile material, and the uranium itself was too difficult to replace. Oak Ridge had made enough for one. The final material left Tennessee in late July. Components crossed the Pacific to Tinian Island, where Little Boy was assembled and loaded into the Enola Gay. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the bomber approached Hiroshima beneath a clear sky. An air raid warning had sounded earlier, then been lifted. People left shelters, returned to breakfast, walked toward factories and offices, and resumed outdoor demolition work intended to create fire breaks against conventional bombing. At 8:15 in the morning, local time, Little Boy fell from the aircraft. 43 seconds later, it detonated approximately 600 meters above the city. The heat blistered and melted roof tiles near the hypocenter. Wooden houses collapsed under the blast, then burned. Within 2 kilometers, almost every building was destroyed or consumed by fire. Concrete structures remained as hollow shells, their windows gone and their interiors burning. Hiroshima later counted 51,787 buildings completely destroyed or burned, in a city that had possessed a little more than 76,000. The city government estimates that approximately 140,000 people had died by the end of December. The number cannot be exact. Records, offices, hospitals, families, and the people who might have counted the dead had disappeared together. In Tennessee, August 6 began as another guarded workday. Operators watched needles. Buses passed the gates. Clerks handled forms stamped with code names. Then supervisors began making announcements. Radios carried President Harry Truman's statement, and residents heard Oak Ridge named before the country. The machinery they had maintained, the pipes they had welded, and the figures they had copied had been connected to a single bomb over a Japanese city. Ruth Huddleston, one of the young Calitron operators, later remembered that her first thought was of her boyfriend returning from the war. Then reports began describing the people killed in Hiroshima, and the meaning of her shift work changed while she was still trying to understand what the plant had made. Other residents felt relief, pride, disbelief, or unease. Oak Ridge had held 75,000 people behind 7 gates, yet the revelation occurred one person at a time. Reporters drove toward those gates. Newspapers that had been forbidden to explain the factories now printed diagrams, official statements, and photographs released by the Army. The Oak Ridge Journal edition, dated August 9, carried a banner headline, "Oak Ridge Attacks Japanese." Beneath it, the paper described workers thrilled by the breaking of the atomic bomb secret and a weapon expected to save lives. The processes inside Y-12 and K-25 remained classified, but the purpose of the Shishi was no longer hidden. 3 days after Hiroshima, the United States dropped a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. On August 14, President Truman announced that Japan had accepted the terms of surrender. That evening, residents packed Jackson Square. They stood shoulder to shoulder between the shops and temporary wartime buildings, holding newspapers above their heads. One enormous headline said the war had ended. Husbands, sons, brothers, and boyfriends might come home. The factory city had completed the task for which it had been built. In Hiroshima, 8 days had passed since the explosion. Survivors were still searching through collapsed neighborhoods. Many who had escaped the immediate blast without visible wounds were beginning to suffer fever, bleeding, exhaustion, and hair loss from radiation, whose effects were not yet understood. Oak Ridge's product had weighed less than 1 adult. By the end of the year, Hiroshima's estimated dead would have filled Oak Ridge nearly twice. The end of the war also removed the deadline that had sustained the city. Construction contracts closed. Temporary operations were reduced. Some facilities continued producing material or conducting research, but they no longer required the wartime workforce assembled in the Tennessee valleys. From the summer through October 1945, approximately 14,000 people were let go at Oak Ridge. The reduction was not a distant economic adjustment. It meant 14,000 pay envelopes ending, dormitory rooms being surrendered, families deciding whether to remain, and identification badges that no longer opened the guarded gates. Only weeks earlier, every additional worker had helped the city reach 50 kilograms. Now the newspapers explaining what those kilograms had done lay folded in kitchens and dormitories, while thousands of the people who had produced them carried their belongings back through Elza Gate. After the cheering in Jackson Square, Oak Ridge began to empty. Construction crews departed. Dormitory beds went unused. Trailers were pulled away, and stores that had learned to serve a city of 75,000 watched their lines shorten. 14,000 workers were released between the summer and October 1945. As Y-12 dismantled most of its wartime Calitron operations, the losses continued. By 1949, more than 20,000 people associated with that plant had lost their jobs. Oak Ridge did not disappear with them. K-25 continued enriching uranium. Y-12 exchanged isotope separation for the manufacture and handling of nuclear weapon components. At X-10, the graphite reactor moved from producing experimental plutonium to supplying radioisotopes and neutron beams for medicine, biology, chemistry, and materials research. On January 1, 1947, the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission inherited the reservation from the Manhattan Engineer District. The following year, the research complex at X-10 formally became Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The Army had built Oak Ridge as a temporary installation. The machinery acquired other assignments. The residential city remained under federal ownership, and the gates remained in place. A visitor still needed authorization to enter. Guards continued searching vehicles at Elza, the principal checkpoint on the eastern approach, even though newspapers, magazines, and newsreels had already shown the country why Oak Ridge existed. That changed on Saturday, March 19, 1949. By morning, a line of automobiles approximately half a mile long had formed outside Elza Gate. Nearly 10,000 residents and visitors gathered inside for a parade, floats, marching bands, speeches, and appearances by Hollywood performers, including Patricia Neal and Donald O'Connor. The city that had spent 6 years keeping strangers outside now invited movie stars to watch it open. At the gate stood a strip of magnesium ribbon. It would not be cut with scissors. George Felbeck, the Union Carbide executive responsible for operating K-25, activated an electrical current connected to the X-10 graphite reactor. The ribbon flashed, burned, and disappeared in a puff of smoke. A reactor built to prove that plutonium could be manufactured had supplied the electricity for removing the barrier around the town that supported it. The guards no longer checked every automobile entering the residential area. Oak Ridge was public. It was not yet independent. The Atomic Energy Commission still owned the houses, commercial buildings, water systems, streets, and much of the land. Residents could drive through Elza Gate without presenting a badge, but they could not govern Oak Ridge as an ordinary incorporated city. Their landlord, utility provider, planning authority, and principal employer remained the same federal agency. Congress began separating those roles in 1955 with the Oak Ridge Disposal Act. The law permitted the Atomic Energy Commission to sell houses and land, transfer municipal facilities, and end its management of the town. It also required Oak Ridge to incorporate. Families who had once received houses according to job classification could now purchase them. Streets designed for a federal reservation became municipal streets. Government tenants became homeowners. On May 5, 1959, Oak Ridge incorporated after residents voted overwhelmingly for self-government under a modified council-manager system. A city created by military order now had a city council, local departments, property owners, and voters. The federal reservation remained beside it and partly within it. Oak Ridge governed the neighborhoods. The federal government kept the guarded plants. Those plants followed separate paths. The original K-25 building stopped operating in 1964, although the larger gaseous diffusion complex continued enriching uranium until 1985 and closed permanently in 1987. Its miles of contaminated piping, compressors, barriers, and process equipment then became a demolition project. Crews began taking down the K-25 building in 2008 and finished in December 2013. By 2020, hundreds of supporting structures across the former diffusion site had also been removed. The U-shaped building that once covered 44 acres is now an outline on the ground. The property has become the East Tennessee Technology Park, containing private businesses, conservation land, and part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. An elevated viewing platform looks across the former K-25 footprint. Visitors can see the full measurement of a building that is no longer there. Y-12 remains behind security fencing. It manufactures and stores enriched uranium components, supports the nuclear weapons stockpile, processes material for United States naval reactors, and performs non-proliferation work. Oak Ridge National Laboratory also remains active, with reactors, neutron sources, laboratories, and computing facilities spread across the old X-10 reservation. The graphite reactor that burned the ribbon at Elza shut down in 1963, exactly 20 years after it first went critical. Its square loading face and rows of horizontal channels remain preserved inside the laboratory grounds. The residential city has settled at roughly 31,000 people, less than half its wartime peak. Many alphabet houses still stand as private homes. Cemesto panels remain beneath later siding. Porches, additions, pitched roofs, gardens, and garages have altered buildings originally identified by letters on government plans. Families live in houses designed when planners believed Oak Ridge might need only 1300 residents. Elza had been a small community before the Army arrived. Its houses and land were absorbed into the reservation, but its name was retained for the gatehouse that controlled the main road into the secret city. The community became a checkpoint. The gatehouse itself has been demolished. At its original location, Elza Gate Park contains walking paths and an exhibit panel showing military police searching an automobile beneath a sign marked Military Area. Nearby traffic moves through a busy intersection at the eastern end of Oak Ridge. Beside the road stands another sign. It reads, Elza Gate Park. Cars pass without lowering their windows, opening their trunks, or handing identification cards to armed guards. The name remains for a place that existed before the fence, survived on the gate, and now stands beside a road where no gate remains.